Good evening, folks. It's nice to see all of you on this warm evening out and about Bellevue. Many of you know this, but we here at this congregation are quite grateful to all of the pastors, but on this evening particularly to Newport's founding pastor, David Meekoff, who established an endowment fund in memory of his late wife, Doreen. An endowment fund which makes this evening possible. Doreen, as many of you know, had particular interests in promoting issues such as worship and social justice and children. On this evening and tomorrow and Sunday, we invite you to help us continue this legacy, if you wish, with a donation to the Meekoff Lecture Fund, a fund which will help us cover expenses and will continue this lecture series for years, if not decades to come. There's an offering plate in the back. Many of you walked right past it, and it will be there tomorrow morning as well. After this evening's lecture, we encourage you to stay for a cup of coffee before you go back out into the cool night air. There will be coffee, some cookies, and some other refreshments, as well as scintillating conversation, I'm sure. We'll convene again tomorrow morning at 9:30, but we encourage you to come because we Presbyterians know how to put on a continental breakfast. If you haven't been to a Presbyterian continental breakfast, please do so. And if you have, come tomorrow to make sure we're still doing it right. Excellent. That will be at 9 o'clock, and then, of course, our lecture series will begin at 9:30. Now, some of you have had the opportunity to meet Tim before this evening. I'm not one of those. But I was able to spend a little bit of time with Tim at dinner just earlier this evening and got to hear a little bit about Tim's story. I'm not going to tell you all of his story because I want him to be able to tell as much of it as he wants. He grew up in the Midwest. We in Kansas call where Tim grew up the upper Midwest. Yes, because indeed. We in Kansas consider Kansas the true Midwest. Yes, but indeed. Michigan, we'll let that slide. At least it's not Ohio. Yes, indeed. I'm with you there. Yes. Tim grew up in Michigan, has been educated in a number of places, including Chicago, and is currently undergoing some educational opportunities. We'll hear more about that in terms of a doctoral program. And one of the things that we Presbyterians sometimes talk about is evolution. And there's this thing here, having experienced a spiritual evolution of his own. Now, this is kind of new to me, because when I think of evolution, I think of dinosaurs and Neanderthals and Australopithecus and all of those kinds of things. So I personally am looking forward to hearing about a new and exciting kind of evolution. Thank you. Reverend Tim Phillips.
Well, I am absolutely impressed that you could name all of those dinosaurs. That is amazing. Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. I like to have a little talk back. You know, us Baptists don't like to just stand there and talk. We expect people to talk back. So feel free to do that. It's an honor to be here with you tonight. It's an honor especially to be remembering the life and the ministry of Doreen Meekoff. Being a preacher's kid, and therefore the son of a preacher's spouse, I have a special fondness for the folks who often find their lives swept up in a ministry they may not have chosen for themselves. And even if they did, I'm well aware that it is a complicated blessing to be married to a pastor. Amen, Patrick says. I'm sure that my own beloved one, Patrick, would you wave? And Doreen could have shared some stories, and I'm sure Patrick would share the story of meeting me and going to his pastor's wife at the time and saying, I've met this person, and I think I'm in love, and he's a pastor, and she said, run away. When I said yes to the series, I did not know that I would be diagnosed with kidney cancer this last summer and face surgery. I did not know that 2 weeks ago my mother's confusion would become so acute that we would need to move her, which we did today. And so I can only say tonight that I am so grateful that Patrick did not run away. Thank you. There's another reason I feel so honored to be part of the series. When I was reading the description, the paragraph about Doreen especially caught my attention. It says, Doreen's final struggle with cancer became the occasion for a deepened experience of worship. She made a special effort to be with the people of the church in worship. That was compelling for me. Given the interest I have in worship, I wondered how it was that worship was deepened for her. How is worship deepened for any of us? So Doreen inspires me this weekend not to take this spiritual practice that we call worship for granted. I should also say that I actually met Newport Presbyterian through Russ and Anita Calhoun. I know that Russ is gone now and that Anita lives in Tacoma, but I knew them when I was working with an organization called Spirit of the Sound, a support organization for Christian, lesbian, hey, hello. You know that organization.
Hi, Ann Paris.
Yes, Ann Paris of the lovely voice. It was an organization of Christian, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender folks. And that was something that Russ and Anita felt strongly about. And I quickly became a fan of those two. And more than that, for those of us who had difficult relationships with our families, Russ and Anita became parents and grandparents for us. So if they are any indication of the community in which I stand right now, I feel like I'm in good hands. Thanks also to the committee that invited me, to Dory Jones Yang for being faithful and patient in your communication with me. As they say in the African American church, I give glory to God and bring greetings from your sisters and brothers at Seattle First Baptist Church and to your pastors and families, Roger and Brenda, Janet and John, and to your founding pastor, David, and his wife, Kelly, to Jennifer, with whom I have always wanted to share worship, and with all of you, grace and peace. Now, you might wonder, and frankly, I have to remind myself sometimes of how it is that this project about evolutionary worship, or evolutionary theology and revolutionary worship, how it all began. And I think there it is. So just let me say that that is not my car. And that's obviously not Seattle because there's no traffic or not much of it there on the road. But this will give you an idea. This is an icon for the conversation. So I was driving home from a long day at the church, and I was doing what I usually do driving home, was to listen to All Things Considered. They were doing a story on Camp Inquiry in upstate New York, where we are told kids hike and swim and tell ghost stories around the campfire, all the usual stuff. They also spend time contemplating the universe without God. That's the next slide, yes. They have little patience with creationist accounts of the origin of life, we are told. And one of the campers says, because you're going to have people like, oh, fossils are planted and they aren't really real, like if the whole theory of evolution, what is this thing about like? But that's it, I guess. Like if the whole theory of evolution is just like a ruse or a prank. Now, by this time, I am yelling at the radio. I am incensed that these kids think believing in God automatically means denying evolution while embracing some ridiculous superstitions they talk about later in the interview. But just as I'm ranting, I get up a good lather, I suddenly stop. if the kids at Camp Inquiry were to show up for worship at Seattle First Baptist Church, would they know that the God they reject is not the one that we worship? Now, there's plenty of reason for them to think that they know what we believe. I don't know that you can actually see the words of this cartoon, this comic behind me. What it says is, there's an angel standing next to what looks like the throne. There's, of course, a white guy with a beard on the throne watching TV. And God is saying, I can't deal with any famines, epidemics, or massacres right now. I've got to help some guy sink a foul shot. Now, if you saw the National College Football Championship on Monday night, you heard the Clemson quarterback say that God wanted his team to win. It makes me wonder what kind of sin there was in the Alabama Coach Saban's life that God wanted Clemson to win and for Alabama to lose. So I'm not surprised that those young people would assume that this is the kind of thing we mean when we talk about God. And I'm not interested in putting together arguments to convince our young atheist friends at Camp Inquiry that they're wrong. What I am interested in is whether or not our authentic, genuine understanding of God is expressed and experienced in worship to such a degree that the kids of Camp Inquiry would know that there's a difference. The editors of Constructive Theology, Serena Jones and Paul Lakeland, say, as scientific legitimacy rose and ecclesial authority receded, the popular language and worship of a God imagined in royal, personalistic terms, who occupies a real place, heaven, and who conducts miracles that contradict nature, became increasingly difficult for theologians to support, despite the fact that pre-modern ideas about God's personhood and place in heaven remained strongly embedded in liturgies, hymns, and, I'm sorry to say, sermons. Did you get that? Serena Jones and Paul Lakeland aren't telling us anything you don't already know. On any given Sunday, there are gaps between our theological understanding and the language of worship. And before we commission a troop of, there's the gap, all right. And before we commission a troop of theology police to patrol worship, oh my. Pastor, I don't know if you have any of those, but I have some theology police. Blessings on you. Who want to patrol worship, let's be clear that there are always and inevitably gaps. There's the theology gap, because it just takes time for our evolving understanding of God to catch up with our language about worship. We know this from the experience of God and gender and the use of inclusive language in worship. It's more than just changing pronouns around. It's about narrowing the gap between our experience of the divine that is both immanent in and transcends gender. There's the historical gap. It takes work to bridge that gap between something that was meaningful in the past and something that might be meaningful to us now. There's the individual and community gap. None of us, you probably know this, none of us have exactly the same experience of God. And yet we try to come together on a Sunday morning to have one experience of worship. Does it matter that the person sitting next to you doesn't believe that God is a person? Can there be any integrity in worship when we don't all believe the same thing? And I'll play my hand a little here and say that we can and should do our best to narrow the gaps, but I don't think authentic worship means closing them. I think, honestly, acknowledging that they're there is important, because it might just be, however, that the gaps are the exact place that God shows up. Now, let me tell you a story. After I graduated from Grand Rapids Baptist College in 1979, I was hired briefly to be the youth pastor at my home church. It was a small conservative Baptist congregation where my dad was the pastor. One of the things, nepotism, right? There you go. One of the things I was required to do was to put together the annual Vacation Bible School program. And I had been secretly flirting with the Presbyterians. Wasn't ready to get married, but I was flirting with the Presbyterians. So I thought it would be a great idea to do a vacation Bible school based on the first 5 questions of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. After all, I told the deacons, the earliest Baptist confessions, this is true, were based on Westminster. I was very enthusiastic, although I heard later that my dad took a lot of heat about this. You can imagine all those good little Baptist kids memorizing the first 5 questions and answers of that 300-year-old Presbyterian document. I can still remember that first question. What is, you know this, right? What is humanity's chief end? Humanity's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy God forever. Now, this was fascinating to me. Here were the folks that I grew up calling the frozen chosen, saying 300 years earlier that humanity's identity and destiny was not only to love God and to glorify God, but to enjoy God. That was mind-blowing. So if that were to be your theological stance, there would be gaps to acknowledge, theological ones and historical ones and individual ones. If this were to be your theological stance, that God was someone or something to be enjoyed, you might ask yourself some questions. And here they are. What is there about God not simply to love or glorify, but to enjoy? Does what you enjoy in worship give you any clues about your understanding of God? Does whatever it is that you enjoy about God get expressed and or experienced in worship? If this were to be your theological stance, those would be some good personal homework questions for tomorrow. What does it mean to you to enjoy God? And does that get expressed in and or has it been experienced in worship? When you come back with your responses, we would have to acknowledge that there is another gap, the cultural one. Whatever it is that you enjoy about God or the divine or the sacred or the holy, whatever that is, would get shaped by the experiences you have in your varied cultures. I used to say in your culture, but the truth is we actually come from various cultures, more than one. And not only would your responses be shaped by your culture or your cultures, those responses would be expressed in the context of your culture. You know, we have the joy of having the Reverend Dr. Patricia Hunter as a member of our staff, as our theologian in residence. She's an African-American woman we share with Mount Zion Baptist Church. Patricia clearly enjoys worship. And one of the things she is very forthright about is that she enjoys, get this, Pastor, she enjoys talking about money. I don't. She loves it. So you can imagine who the first one up is in stewardship, right? It's Dr. Patricia Hunter. I have a white colleague who says, well, you know, when I go to white liberal churches, I would much rather talk about sex than to talk about money. That says something about our culture. The cultural gap that I think most distresses what we would call the modern mainline church, and I will use these words sort of interchangeably, but what I mean are churches like us, churches like Newport Presbyterian, like Salem First Baptist Church, modern mainline churches or established churches or churches of the historic ecumenical movement, is the gap that has been described as modernity versus post-modernity. Now, I know these, you know, I spend time writing my doctoral work, and then I have to use these words that not even a computer recognizes. Modernity versus post-modernity. When the great socio-religious analyst Phyllis Tickle, has anybody read any of Phyllis? Phyllis is a great person. She's gone now. We lost her last year, I think. When she wrote her book, The Great Emergent, she observed what they, the modern mainline established churches, saw, by and large, and only at first, was a generational issue. The young were leaving, as the young always do, as the boomers had always done, and the Gen Xers after them. They would come to their senses, and they would come home to Mother Church under whatever defining adjectives or surnames she might live. The error in this assessment, and as an assessment it did not last long, is that it failed to understand that we had slipped our moorings, at least temporarily. As a whole culture, as a social unit, we had at last become truly postmodern, post-denominational, post-rational, post-enlightenment, post-literate, post-almost everything else that only a century before we had been, including post-Christendom, not Christianity, post-Christendom. And these emergent, so these folks who have made their home in this postmodern world, these emergent, whose numbers increasingly included the white-haired as well as the young, could now use the term inherited church to name the goods being placed on the rummage sale table. Inherited church, that from which they had come and to which they literally now had no means of returning, let alone any desire at all to do so. So, you may want to know what postmodernity is. A little note about that, it's almost impossible to define. Postmoderns resist tightly drawn distinctions and definitions. The postmodern biblical scholar A.K.M. Adam writes that the pursuit of precise definitions can itself be one of the marks of modernity. The fact that we want it defined is sort of a modernist kind of thing. A postmodern introduction would be less likely to answer that question, what is postmodern biblical criticism, and more likely to answer the question, what might postmodern biblical criticism be? What are some postmodern biblical criticisms? Do you get the distinction? It's not about what it is, but what does it do? How many of them are there? Those intellectual or academic criticisms taken together, Adam says, form a movement of resistance to the notion that humanity has progressed to the highest pinnacle of achievement under the aegis of Enlightenment Euro-American efforts. In other words, what has been seen as the modern liberal agenda has been unmasked as a matter of social privilege. That's why folks in the liberation movement, like African-American Cornel West, are identified with postmodern religious thought. Now, the easiest way I can think to illustrate the distinctions between modernity and postmodernity is in terms of the two things I hear from folks who are part of our Explore class for prospective members at Seattle First Baptist Church. I often hear two contradictory descriptions of their experience with us. On the one hand, we don't believe anything. And simultaneously, on the other, we believe everything. Now, it's not really clear how both of those things could be true. But it's not about whether it's true or not, or fair or not, because in some ways it is actually true of us. And I guess we're not alone in that. So we don't believe anything. Now, when people say this, they're talking about our modernist selves. See if you don't recognize this. The rational, scientific, deconstructing, demythologizing part of our understanding of God. It describes our search for some universal truths that are fixed and can apply fairly across the board. They hear what sounds like a vision, that there is one mythic story that can explain everything, or what postmoderns call a meta-narrative. I like that word. Meta-narrative. Where, of course, we identify with the enlightened heroes and heroines. In our modern selves, we focus on facts. We default to experts. The fact that I'm standing here lecturing to you now is a very modern way of thinking about how people learn. And then finally, there's our proud history, which we like to talk about a lot, that gives the impression that the institutions we have created, we trust. The other observation I hear is that we believe everything. When people say this, they're talking about our postmodern selves, the pluralist, experiential, remythologizing part. It's the part of us that is more concerned about being true to ourselves, to who we are and our experience, than finding some grand universal mythic story that applies to everyone, whether they like it or not. It gets expressed in an appreciation for a wide variety of stories that connect us to authentic and therefore true human life. Our postmodern selves focus on feelings, and we appreciate the collective wisdom of community. And community is a major value for us as a sense of belonging. We often talk about this at Seattle First Baptist as a matter of home. And we see it as central to who we are. That the pastor who is on his way out east says that I have said, and it's true, that at First Baptist we have 3 holidays, 3 holy days: Christmas, Easter, homecoming. It's that big a deal for us, this sense of home. Because some of us know what it is not to be at home, not to have a home. Now let me say that there's a lot to be said for modernity. I don't want you to think that by saying that we live in this sort of struggle between modernity and postmodernity, that somehow postmodernity is good and modernity is bad. I do not believe that. There's a lot of good things to say about it. It was a modernist, historical, critical approach to the Bible that saved my spirituality and probably, frankly, saved my life. Not the literalist view, that would have killed me. One of my great heroes is Harry Emerson Fosdick. Anybody here a Fosdick fan? Great American Baptist preacher who served a Presbyterian church in New York. I always say he's my hero because he managed to simultaneously divide two different denominations. The Presbyterians got divided because he was the pastor of this Presbyterian church, and the American Baptists got divided because he was the pastor of Riverside Church eventually. You got to respect something like that. He was the modernist preacher who was famous in 1922 for his Shall the Fundamentalists Win sermon. I owe a lot to modernist Christianity. And given the last election, I think we can pretty clearly see that it's a dangerous thing when feelings become an excuse for dismissing the facts. Even when it comes to institutions, there's something to be said for modernity. At Seattle First Baptist, we have a number of young people who joined us during the days of the Occupy encampment at Seattle Central. For all that movement's talk about dismantling institutions, they discovered that the history and resources and structured long-term commitment of a religious institution like ours has its place. Postmodern philosopher John Caputo, who teaches at Syracuse, says, so let me go on record, his book is called Truth, and then the first chapter is about why he doesn't mean truth. He does mean, however, thought in process or thought in transit. He sees truth as a trip that you're taking. So let me go on record at the start of the trip, he says, I pledge my troth to the breakthrough made. I love that old word. We don't say that in weddings anymore. I pledge thee my troth. To the breakthrough made by the Enlightenment. It liberated us from the church, superstition and royal lines of authority and replace them with civil liberties and scientific research and technological advances. I have no interest in simply opposing enlightenment, he says, but I do think the old enlightenment has done all the good it's going to do, and we now need a new one. Not an anti-enlightenment, but a new enlightenment. Caputo ends up having some generally positive things to say about modern religious communities if, for instance, the institutions that we have cherished are vehicles for genuine community rather than an end in themselves. If that happens, then we have something very important to offer post-modernity. And back to my Occupy friends, when the Occupy movement started to wane, they realized that there was still a community of people that shared at least some of their values and had resources to move those values forward. Or when we talk about history and verifiability, we aren't just talking about facts, but also feelings as part of that more comprehensive understanding of human life. Or when we hear the particular stories of people whose stories may have been overlooked or denied, we don't try to compare them against some idea of a universal humanity, but instead look for the connections in them to our lives. The problem, I think, is that some of what passes for postmodern emerging church is sometimes pre-modern in its theological understanding and actually denies the sensibilities of postmodern culture. Is Dan up there? Oh, yes. Now, I will confess that I have a nemesis in this project. There he is, Dan Kimball. Much of what is meant by postmodernity in some of the evangelical emerging churches has to do with a cultural style, with a sense of community, a reclaiming of tradition, which, whether it's theirs or not, that's one of the things that really irritates me. They just borrow from any tradition they want to without any context for where it came from or what it meant. And openness to some kind of social engagement. Folks like Dan Kimball and Mark Driscoll, there's a name you haven't heard for a while, claim a postmodern cultural form in various ways while at the same time resisting the postmodern function. For instance, Dan Kimball suggests in this book that his postmodern theotopical approach, that he made up that word, theotopical approach to preaching means regularly teaching, now imagine this from the pulpit of Newport Presbyterian, regularly teaching what it means that Jesus is the only way to God, but, he says, be nice about it because postmodern people are very sensitive about this. Regularly addressing human sexuality, especially about the reasons why homosexuality is sin. Teaching about hell more than ever because, as he says, Jesus sure talked about it a lot. I don't know, what Jesus is he talking about? And finally, teaching that the scriptures are trustworthy in a way that seems to rely on a kind of decontextualized understanding of inspiration that resists any kind of what he calls relativism. Oh my God, relativism. Now, if the key value of postmodernity is authenticity, being true, you can perhaps see why some of these emerging churches eventually implode. Mars Hill being the primary example. What those churches seem to promise culturally, they cannot deliver theologically. And so people become disillusioned and feel betrayed. In Mark Driscoll's case, his postmodern cultural style belied an authoritarian fundamentalist gospel that, according to Crosscut, had an outrageous and psychologically damaging effect on his followers. A former staff member wrote an article apologizing to women, gay people, and to non-religious people who see Jesus as a warrior with a whip or a judgmental dictator because of the example we, Mars Hill, set. If this is what modern mainliners, if this is what we look at and we think, oh gee, that must be the postmodern church, it's no wonder that we're suspicious, right? It's not just about different styles of worship, it's about a major theological disconnect. This isn't the gospel that we know. But here's the problem, as Phyllis Tickle describes it. Whatever the modern mainline may have in common with the understandings and the values of postmodernity, our churches are identified with modernity. And there's theologian Thomas Oden, who says the church that weds itself to modernity is already a widow. John Behrens and Rebecca Ann Parker tell the story of Amy Moses Lagos, who they say realized at a protest rally that, this is her words, my liberal religious upbringing had taught me to work for social justice, but it hadn't connected activism to theology, to spiritual practice, or to ritual. Behrens and Parker write that the liberal religious home and church in which Amy was raised began to erode its own foundations long ago. It introduced important reforms, but in the process it emphasized individual dissent over community building, the primacy of reason over the importance of relationships, and progress toward an idealized future over stewardship of what's already here. Behrens and Parker, Unitarians as they are suggesting that the legacy of the modern mainline church could be lost if it doesn't find a way to tap into those genuine postmodern sensitivities that we already have. We're not making this stuff up. This is part of who we are. The embrace of pluralism, okay with you all? Engaging the heart, appreciating the wisdom of the community, and understanding the ultimate rationale for institution is to be communities of belonging. And here's some good news. Are you ready for some good news? There is some. Some of those postmodern emerging leaders are discovering that they have more in common with the mainline than they do with their evangelical colleagues. Phyllis Tickle sees a convergence happening, especially with people like Rachel Held Evans and Rob Bell. Any of you know Rob Bell? Yeah, Love Wins. And Brian McLaren. This bodes well, I think, if we modern mainliners can keep from freaking out, I use that technical term, freaking out about some of the ways, the authentic ways, these folks talk about their evolving spirituality. We've had both Rachel Held Evans and Rob Bell at our place, and every time this happens, we have some folks who say, that evangelical language just drives me crazy. And I say, are you listening to what they're saying? They sound more like us than we do sometimes. Get over it. This bodes well because they're talking about their lives in authentic ways, and they're talking about their lives almost to a person in terms of an evolving, here we go, Pastor, evolving spirituality. All of them. It's one of those things where you notice it once, it's like a new word you learn, and then every place you look, there it is. When I started down this road, I thought, oh, this is interesting about the whole evolving spirituality thing, and then it was there, and it was there. I finally just stopped underlining things because it was everywhere. In fact, I think it is exactly this evolutionary understanding of God that we modernist Christians have in particular to offer. Having made our peace with the science of evolution a few generations back, modern mainline churches can find a footing, I'm suggesting, by not just accepting evolution as a scientific theory, but claiming it as a metaphor for understanding God. Did you get that? We're not just going to say, oh yeah, there's religion and there's science, and science says evolution, and we say, okay, great, that's wonderful, we'll go along with that. We actually see the science of evolution as a metaphor for how we understand God. Now, I'm not alone in this. The Living the Questions folks, they do video series for adult learning. This is one of their newest ones. Science, Religion, and an Evolving Faith. What's interesting about this series is that not only are the contributors the usual suspects from the Mainline that you always hear on these kind of video things, it also includes Rachel Held Evans. One of the leading emerging church personalities is one of the main contributors to the video. In fact, Rachel, who grew up and went to college in the hometown of the Scopes Monkey tribe, Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee. She says, "I'm an evolutionist because I believe that the best way to reclaim the gospel in times of change is not to cling more tightly to our convictions, but to hold them with an open hand. I'm an evolutionist because I believe that sometimes God uses changes in the environment to pry idols from our grip and to teach us something new. But most of all, I am an evolutionist because my own story is one of unlikely survival. If it hadn't been for evolution, I might have lost my faith." I don't know where you come from, what you would call that, but in the Baptist tradition, we call that a testimony. It's because of evolution that I have not lost my faith. And notice the postmodern nature of this testimony. It's not about being rationally convinced of the scientific theory of evolution. The science is fine and even helpful, but this is how she understands the movement of her own spiritual development. Evolution is for her a theological metaphor. Now, one of my theological mentors, that's Gordon Kaufman, a Mennonite theologian at Harvard, says evolutionary theory has now become the great all-comprehensive picture that integrates the highly diverse feature of our universe under one grand concept. Now, that's a lot of words, but postmoderns would be skeptical of this, right? Because they don't like one grand concept of anything. But it is true that you could imagine this evolutionary metaphor as a way of understanding a lot of things about life in the world. But when I'm talking about evolution as a theological metaphor, I'm talking about a movement through orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. You may recognize this pattern if any of you have done any reading with Walter Brueggemann about the Psalms. He uses this pattern as well to understand the Psalms. But what is interesting here is that Kaufman, as well as this evangelical person, Rachel Held Evans, and Rob Bell for that matter, use this language to describe their spiritual development and their understanding of God. So, orientation. I had come to the conclusion that all theological ideas, Kaufman says, including the idea of God, could best be understood as products of the human imagination when employed by men and women seeking to orient themselves to life. The way we think about God is important because it orients us to life. His student, Sally McFaig, suggests that the models we use to orient ourselves to God, to the God-world, human-world relationship in the present context, are important because by them we create the reality in which we live. The metaphors she likes to work with are God as mother, lover, and friend. And if you haven't read her book called Models of God, it's an amazing book. She also, by the way, is very much concerned about the ecological health of the planet. The whole point of a theological understanding is to help us be oriented to ourselves and the world and to God or the sacred. But sometimes, or maybe eventually, those orientations break down. Have you noticed this? Disorientation happens. Those are experiences that also contribute to the movement of spiritual understanding. Kaufman says, what if this deep structure in the form that we've acquired it no longer fits well the world in which we live, and thus, instead of orienting us with respect to the world, misleads and disorients us? Disorientation can be events. If you believe in the natural goodness of human beings, the Holocaust might be disorienting to you. 9/11, remember 9/11? Can you believe that there are children born now and involved in the world who have no clue what we mean when we say 9/11? That was disorienting. This election is disorienting, at least to me. It's some situation for which there just isn't some adequate answer. Disorientation can be an experience, a shocking illness or a loss, an existential dark night of the soul, an epiphany, that's the season that we're in, a realization that something that oriented you to the world isn't able to do that anymore. Maybe it's recognizing that there's a gap between what we thought we believed and what we discover we actually believe. Has that ever happened to any of you? Maybe it's just a general sense of being lost. In the biblical tradition, it is the work of the prophets to disorient us, to make us examine our lives and the world in a way that smashes our convenient idolatries, to, as they say, afflict the comfortable. Right? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Now, I suspect we all have some moment of disorientation in our lives, and the point of this evolutionary model is to say that disorientation isn't something outside our spiritual experience. It's part of it. It's hard and it's difficult and it's not easily answered. One of the great gifts of the modernist approach to faith for me was that I didn't have to be afraid of these moments anymore. I didn't have to pretend them away or dismiss them as a lack of faith. And that disorientation led to a newer, more true understanding of myself and the world and God. And that's the point. Because that's part of the movement toward some new orientation or reorientation. Now here's our friend Kaufman again. It's no longer possible, he says, to connect in an intelligible way today's scientific, cosmological, and evolutionary understandings of the origins of the universe and the emergence of life. Let me just say for a minute, I love Gordon Kaufman. Those of you who are New Testament scholars will recognize that he writes very much like the Apostle Paul. You read and you read and you read, and there's got to be a period in here somewhere. We can't look at these traditional understandings of God in the same way anymore. However, he says, the metaphor of creativity, that's his metaphor. A descendant of the biblical concept of creation and directly implied in the idea of evolution itself, has resources for constructing a religiously pertinent and meaningful modern, postmodern conception of God. He goes on to say that we did not create the evolutionary process, but in it there is a powerful, awe-inspiring creativity manifest in our midst. And this serendipitous creativity provides grounds for our hope for the future. Now that is a lot of words. So let me talk about this process in the story of an emerging and probably now would describe himself as a post-evangelical pastor, Rob Bell. After all the grief he took about writing Love Wins, that essentially questioned the existence of hell, which you'd think, these days that wouldn't be such a big deal, but he lost several members of his congregation. He was ostracized from a number of evangelical communities. He found himself in front of several thousand members of his congregation on an Easter morning. He says that Easter Sunday was fairly traumatic because I realized that without some serious reflection and study and wise counsel, I couldn't keep going without losing something vital to my sanity. Now, if this is what you're thinking on an Easter morning, facing 1,000 of your members, you're in trouble, right? The only way forward, he says, was to plunge head first into my doubts and swim all the way to the bottom. And if I had to, in the end, walk away. Now, imagine, he's standing in front of his congregation. These things are running through his head. If I have to walk away, I can at least do so in good conscience, because at least I would have my integrity. This emerging church pastor had this moment of disorientation on stage in one of the country's largest evangelical churches on an Easter morning, and he knew what was at stake: his integrity and his authenticity. And the only way to get to those things was to genuinely face his doubts. In a later book, Bell says that he wrote that book about becoming more and more alive and aware, orienting ourselves around the God which I believe is the ground of our being. Doesn't sound like an evangelical anymore, right? The God who is the ground of our being, the electricity that lights up all the lights in the house, the transcendent presence in our tastes, sights, and sensations of the depth and dimension and fullness of life, from joy to agony to everything else. Bell, like Rachel Held Evans and Gordon Kaufman, is telling a story of this evolutionary movement as a movement through orientation. What's the next one? Disorientation, and then? And let me be clear that this movement is not guaranteed, and it's not about inevitable progress. Disorientation can be so frightening that people retreat to some previous orientation with even more passion. And they can become stuck in a spiritual loop that depends on their denying what is really happening to them in the world. And as Walter Brueggemann says, the reorientation of today can become the disorientation of tomorrow. To claim an evolutionary understanding of ourselves and God and the world is to commit ourselves to a journey that is as hard as it is hopeful. In 1967, with Senator Joe McCarthy on a rampage, Dr. King gave his last presidential address for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. He closed that address by saying, "When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in the universe, working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward what? Justice. This is our hope," he said, "for the future, and with that faith, we will be able to sing, 'We shall overcome.'" Oh, come on, sing it. "We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." It is 8:30, and that is the end of the page. Are there opportunities for questions at this point? Yes, I'm getting a yes from Janet. So this is a lot to take in. I realize tomorrow we'll do a little more as it sort of transitions from evolutionary theology to what I'm calling revolutionary worship, but questions that you might have.
What did that young man do on Easter Sunday? After he had his moment of crisis, what did he
He preached whatever sermon he was going to preach, and he walked out and he left that church. He's out here on the East Coast somewhere. When we had him, he was just, what's that? West, did I say East Coast? Thank you. The West Coast, yeah. And he's doing, the last I knew, he was doing retreats of various kinds. And he had, when he was at First Baptist, he had just finished What Are We Talking About When We Talk About God, which is a great book, I think. Again, you know, I just want to be really clear about this. One of the things that is happening in post-modernity with the sort of breakdown of institutions, or at least they're not nearly as rigid as they used to be, is that people who live in the evangelical silo are discovering that there's all of these great things over here in the Mainline. And my fear is that because, I don't know why, what the historic reality of this is, but for whatever reason, we in the modern church don't seem to be moving in the same direction to meet them. And one of the reasons why this project is so important to me is because I think there's an opportunity here for there to be a convergence. You know, when we had Rachel Held Evans at First Baptist Church, the place was packed with young women. Packed. When we had Rob Bell, packed.
With young men.
With young men. Was it because they were coming to Seattle First Baptist Church? No. They were coming to hear someone who was saying, with some language tweaks, saying exactly the same thing that they would have heard if they were there on a Sunday morning. Now we have to find some way, we have to find some way to make at least part of that journey, I think. That's what I'm appealing for. They are beginning to find their way. Brian McLaren has taken a lot of heat for a lot of the heretical things that he has said from his sort of evangelical end, or I think he does say he's a post-evangelical end of the conversation. But it's harder. Phyllis Tickle, I think, has done a great job for trying to move some of us in the modern mainline more in the direction of at least having a conversation and seeing the connections with these folks who have been treated horribly by their own traditions. Rachel Held Evans has had threats against her. She's had a horrible time because she's standing up for the truth, because she would say out loud, I'm an evolutionist. It seems like we as modern mainline Christians should look at that and say, man, we need to pray for you. We need to support you. We need to have you in our churches talking about why this is so important for you to make the kind of commitments that you have made in the face of all of this anger and distancing from their own traditions. Barbara.
Do you see this reorientation in your own congregation?
Was that the question you were going to ask? Oh. Yes, I think we'll talk about more about that tomorrow. At least how that works into the experience of worship. I think one of the things that's happened in a place like First Baptist is that in this modernist experience of our faith, we are much more likely to show up for an event like this and listen to someone talk about what they understand their faith to be than we are to sit in a room and talk to one another about what our faith is. And so a few years ago, the adult learning folks decided that they would reserve 6 to 8 weeks for people to come in and just tell their stories. Those are wildly successful because we don't get a chance to just hear people talk about their spiritual lives. And I think reimagining who we are as a theological people, right? Not just, socially active people. We are certainly that, not just as a progressive congregation, but as people who do think theologically about our lives, to actually talk to one another about that. And so in some way, I think that's part of the reimagining process for us, that we are all capable of talking about how God is active in our lives and not having to agree that your experience is the same as mine for us to have a common experience of God. Okay.
When you talked about integrity, I think you just a little while ago, I had to, and I can't remember now how you phrased it, but I couldn't help but think about John Lewis,
Yes.
congressman, and what happened with him today. And I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want to get to the political stuff, but talk about somebody who's been through a lot,
Right.
and is standing up for what he believes.
That's right. Yeah, authenticity and integrity is the watchword for post-modernity. Whatever you do, again, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but whatever you do in worship is not so important as being genuine, being real. I used to say that when people walk into First Baptist Church, if they, especially of a certain generation, if they get a sense that we're being something that we aren't really, at least to some degree, they have finely tuned BS meters. And they'll know, and they won't come back. So it isn't that we all have to agree or even that we all have to be on even the same page for worship to do its thing, but if we create an environment in which people are free to be genuine, to keep their integrity and to be authentic, then people know that. People will see that. People recognize that. Really.
You talked about the cultures. I think that the Mainline has a culture, and conservative/fundamentalist evangelicalism is a culture.
Yes, indeed.
I have found that a lot of Mainliners have no clue as to what this evangelicalism. You've been there, I've been there.
Yeah.
We know it. So when we hear Rachel Held Evans, we cheer because here's someone who is moving out of the box.
Right.
And these people give a voice to those who are looking to reorient themselves to another way of being in their faith. So, I just think that's an interesting phenomenon.
It is. We had Rachel with us as part of our Romney lecture series, and I was the one that brought this to the committee, and a couple of the committee members went, online to see who this person was, and I got a very distraught call from one of them saying she went to Bryan College. I said, I know. Well, you know what Bryan College is about? I said, I do. Well, why do you want her to come here? I said, have you read anything that she said? Now, this is the reverse, right? It used to be, in fact, I remember, somebody asked me once why I went to the University of Chicago Divinity School as a good little fundamentalist kid. You know why? Because at that time I said, I want to teach modern religious thought, and that means I'm going to have to talk about liberals, and I don't know any. I might as well go someplace where there are some, and they can tell me what it is they really think. Now, here I am, right? So maybe what they were afraid of actually happened, I don't know. But I find there is this, we claim that everybody else is so isolated and insulated, and we're the ones who know, what's going on in the world. And it's just not true. Because there are these people out there who are making this move, with this, as I say, this evolutionary move, and we're suspicious, or at least some folks are, they're suspicious, they're afraid of what will happen if they come in and start talking about what's important to them. And I don't understand. Have a Buddhist come in and talk about their spirituality, and we're all, yay, hooray! An evangelical talk about how she's moved. Oh, my Lord, no, that's too far. I don't get that. It just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. It did at one point, but it doesn't anymore.
perhaps you'll deal with this tomorrow, but one of the struggles I have is the language of worship,
Uh-huh.
let alone the language of theology.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the language, whether it is the language around the Eucharist or baptism, represents, it throws my head into a place I really don't want to go. I don't believe Jesus intended me to go.
Uh-huh.
And it also, then I want to add to it, the language of our hymns. You mentioned hymns
Right.
earlier in the presentation. The truth is, those hymns carry a spiritual energy that the language sometimes is right on, sometimes it's not.
Absolutely.
But it's very hard to say no to the hymns, particularly when in recent times the substitute has been praise music where the theology is gross. And yet everybody is standing up going crazy. And I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, we will talk some about this tomorrow, I think. But I want to go back to this construction, these elements of evolution. It is the case that some people's spiritual lives are oriented in a particular way. Now, I'll give you an example. We have a number of people in our congregation who have gone through recovery. And some of them, not all of them, use religious language in a very conservative sounding way. And it makes me nervous when I hear them, and then I think, now wait a minute, for these folks, having very somewhat black and white understandings of what it is they're being asked to do is very orienting for them. Right? There's no gray for them, because if there's gray, then they're in trouble. And so when they talk about their spiritual lives in these sort of conservative-sounding black and white ways, I have to say to myself, this person is orienting their life with this language. It's not my language, but I have to recognize the role it plays in that person's life. There are people who are in what I'll call a chronic state of disorientation. I mean, there's always something, and it's the chronic disorientation people who end up in the theology patrol in worship, because everything irritates them, right? And I have to say, okay, look, so these folks, I'm being honest here, these folks have an important function, and that is to keep our eyes open to the ways in which some way of orienting ourselves is perhaps not constructive. That is, it could be damaging. So that sort of chronic disorientation does have its purpose. In fact, when people come to me and say, well, those atheists are at it again, I say, go for it. Atheists have a very important task. That's deconstruct those images that we have of God that have become idolatrous. I don't have a problem with atheists. They're doing their work. I am not one. I would love to have spent some time with these kids at Camp Inquiry. We would have some very fascinating conversations, I suspect. But this sort of chronic disorientation, I think, has its place too. As long as we move, and we're open to moving, to a reorientation. So, say for instance, and I'm glad you brought up the hymns. When I was going through my coming out experience, there were some hymns that I never wanted to hear again, much less sing. One of them was just as I am without one plea, but that your blood was shed for me. Okay? Somewhere along the line, as I was struggling to come to terms with the truth about my life, do you know what I found myself humming? Just as I am. That's not a joke. I mean, somehow that was reorienting to me. It wasn't that old orientation, because I had been through this disorientation process that meant whatever I meant by just as I am without one plea now is not the same as before. But it was still powerful. Several years ago, we had a hymn sing at the church I was serving in Chicago, and somebody wanted us to sing, let's see, He leadeth me. He leadeth me by his own hand. Any of you know this song? Well, you know, we were doing our best at Grace Baptist Church to use inclusive language. And so the person said, you know, if you were going to ask for the hymn to be sung, you had to tell why it was important. And this sweet young man said, you know, I love this hymn, and sometimes I just feel lost. And I find myself humming this hymn, and instead of singing, He leadeth me, I just started singing, She leadeth me, she leadeth me. Oh my God. Right to the heart. I can't sing that song anymore without singing, She leadeth me, she lead. Because it's gone through this disorientation process and now is reoriented for me in a way that it never was before. I didn't care about that song for any reason, except that now it has this context, it has this story, this testimony attached to it that makes it not only singable, but powerful for me. Yeah.
So I have a great fear that this might be too much of a modern question. And not
Oh, no, please, don't, no.
But can you flesh out the analogy that you're talking about between evolution and God?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, I'm not quite making the connection of what that analogy is, so I need some fleshing out.
Okay. I'm talking about the process of evolution as a metaphor for the way we talk about God. So I'm not trying to say God is evolution, but what I am saying is that there is no part of this evolutionary process, whether it's orientation or disorientation or reorientation, where God is not. Right. So however you understand God, however you see the presence of the divine in the world is in each one of those experiences of life.
Aren't you saying God is not static?
That would be a good way. God is not static. God moves with us through that process. It's in process theologian language, God is the one who lures us into the future. I may not be clear enough for you because I'm not trying to make a theological statement about God as evolution. I'm saying that one of the ways that we understand God is through this metaphor of evolution. And that they're not the same thing. So for me, so here's a good example. I'm sorry. So here's the thing. So for some of my friends, Rita will understand this. For some of my friends at First Baptist Church, they get very uncomfortable when they're the most uncomfortable in worship at prayer time. Right? Because the language about prayer seems very awkward to them. Are we really praying to some, divine being out there that's going to do what we ask God to do because that's God's job? And I say, look, the thing about prayer is that whatever it is you believe is happening in prayer, we are doing it together. That by itself is an amazing gift we give to one another. That we gather in a room, and if you have a concern, I'm going to take it on as my own. That's prayer. We're going to gather them up together, and we're going to hold them as a community. That's prayer. Do I believe that there's an energy already involved in that, that is engaged in that? Yes. In fact, if you want to know, I tell my congregation this, if you want to know what I believe about God, read Ephesians 3. Paul said, well, whoever wrote Ephesians, there is a power already at work within you that is able to accomplish far more than you can ask or imagine. That's God. From my understanding, that's God. And the important thing about that is that God is throughout that process. Wherever you are, there is a power that's at work within you to accomplish far more than you can ask or imagine. To me, that's what I mean when I talk about God. That's what I'm accessing when I pray. That's what I'm trusting when I'm in the middle of some horrible, disorienting experience. There is a power already at work within me, able to do far more than I can ask or imagine. That's my answer as best I can give it. I do want to leave room for people who have a different understanding of God than I do, because we are all part of this evolving understanding. People are in different places. My place is not better than theirs, it's just different. So that's my answer. I feel like I'm at an ordination council. I hope I pass.
Thank you, Tim. As mentioned previously, please stick around for a while. There's coffee, there's refreshments. You'll have some opportunity to talk with Tim and others, just to kind of disorient yourself. And just to let you know, I'm not naming names or pointing fingers, but at least one individual has pulled out a Bible and started to read Ephesians 3.
I have done my work.
Thank you all very much. Please remember, we're going to have a continental breakfast tomorrow morning. It'll be about 9-ish, and then the lecturing stuff will begin about 9:30. Thank you all.
Where's the breakfast? Great Hall?
Right out there. Where refreshments